Thanks, Jim. Overly generous introduction as usual, and I promise this is the last time you have to hear from me this year, so you won't have to suffer through me again tomorrow. I wanted to talk today about kinship networks and health. I think this is a kind of a missed area in the social networks field. A lot of early social networks were focused on kinship and family networks, and then it kind of took a different path for a long time. And so I'm trying to, with my work, to kind of reinvigorate analysis of it. My goal for today is to talk about social networks and health and get you thinking about what network we're actually looking at and what network we're modeling. Thinking about within kind of the world of our social worlds and our social networks that we pay attention to, how central families really are to the evolution of our ideas, our health, a lot of the important activities we engage in. Then I'll talk through kind of data limitations and strengths for looking at this. I think that a lot of traditional network measures have not done a good job of enumerating family and kinship networks. And then I'll talk through what I view as sort of my framework for looking at them and some potential modeling advances. These include kind of a mathematical approach, a simulation-based approach, and then what I call, for lack of a better word, like a data fusion approach, like take two things and smush them together is the other way I sometimes refer to it. And then at the end, I'll conclude with some resources that are available for doing some of this. The tools have come a really long way in the last 2 or 3 years to make it really possible. I spent years working on some of these things that now you could do very quickly, given tools that have been made available by some great computer scientists and demographers at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. So when we think about social networks, we often, I think, are thinking of our friend networks, right? That is in part because of the modern world, and like Facebook kind of co-opted the term social network, and it was a kind of friend-based network. But this is not just a feature of kind of Facebook, right? It's also the social networks literature itself heavily emphasizes friendship networks. If you look at kind of social networks articles published in Web of Science, I found 75,000 articles listing social networks as a topic that they looked into. However, only about 8% of those actually mention family or kinship networks within the kind of title abstract keywords. If you look in the Journal of Social Networks itself, they make all their publications available. It looks to me like they've published about 1,400 articles in total. And if you look at the kind of amount of those articles that talk about family or kinship or other kinds of non-friend-based, non-acquaintance-based networks, it's only about 10%. This is partly reflecting an early focus in the social networks literature, almost explicitly not on families, right? Like very small percentage of the articles were on families at that point. It kind of grew to about 10% in recent decades and sort of has stayed there. But I think if you think of like what networks matter, who matters in our networks, it's probably more than 10% of them are family, in my opinion. I think this kind of leads us to be kind of driving with a blindfold on. Family ties are really central to a lot of the well-known kind of network findings in the literature. And if you queried social network experts, they would probably not recognize this, for instance. For instance, one of the very classic network studies is Search for an Abortionist in the 1970s. This is or 1960s, pre-Roe v. Wade kind of being passed, so when abortion was illegal. And it was a great early network study where she looked at how people go about learning about where to find an abortion when they're faced with an unplanned pregnancy that they want to terminate. She found that about 50% of the people, the first people that they asked, were family network-based kind of ties. If you think of the classic studies about social isolation in America, Peter Morrison's work, or the great work done by people at Duke, Miller McPherson, Lynn Smith-Lovin, and others, this study kind of emphasized this declining in our social kind of networks over time. But an unspoken, I mean, it's in the paper in sort of a footnote, but an unspoken portion of that is that 69% of the US population was nominating more family-based networks in that close matters, who you talked to about important matters, name generator, than non-family networks. And I think in the kind of contemporary era, one of the biggest studies of social networks and health that kind of kicked off a lot of interest in this field came from Fowler and Christakis in a series of studies where they found that obesity seems to be contagious, was the argument they made. There was later refinements to that. But obesity was, networks looked like they were spreading obesity, looked like they were spreading smokiness, loneliness, and other things like that. But in that study, on which all of those findings are based, over half of the ties are actually family or extended family kind of ties. And I don't think most people recognize that as a major component of what's driving that kind of those findings. Of course, there are lots of things that are not health, where social networks seem to be less family dependent. For instance, a really classic study of the Small World Network conducted back in the 60s, where they had people send letters to kind of a random target across the country. Only a small proportion of those operated through family networks. And then the classic strength of weak ties Granovetter argument, where people were looking to find jobs. He had the kind of theoretical paper, but there's also a book about it. And in the book, if you kind of look at who people go through to learn about jobs that they obtain, only about a third of those are kind of family-based ties. I think that when you're thinking about where family ties really fit heavily in people's social networks, I think it's really critical to pay attention to life course stages. For young children, family ties are absolutely essential. For older adults, family ties are essential. In the Middle Ages, it's a little bit less common. So this is a graph of by age on the bottom in the 85, 2004, and 2010 General Social Survey, questions about important matters. And you can see that the family ties tend to be dominant in sort of the older ages, not in the kind of 20 to 50, 60 kind of age range. Similarly, if we look at like who we spend time with through the American Time Use Survey, family ties are incredibly dominant in the older adult phase. This is particularly the partnership ties, a little bit less in the kind of midlife ties in terms of daily activities. So what do we know about family and kinship ties? There are a really interesting and important set of kind of anthropological, I call them, methods in social networks used to examine family ties from a kind of structural network-based perspective. These include Doug White's kind of work looking at kind of matrimonial circuits and other kind of formal anthropological definitions, trying to figure out, for instance, how often different tribes might have their cousins marrying each other that creates certain kind of structural considerations in a kind of smaller society setting. There's also great work by Klaus Hamburger and others in Europe kind of coming up with more modern ways of calculating matrimonial circuits and other kind of anthropological notions of structural cohesion, similar to some of the positional ideas that Jim was talking about previously. But this is something of a niche kind of area, and it's not heavily employed in the social networks world. So I think what's really important is to think through like how could we employ understanding family and kin-based networks in kind of contemporary societies, large-scale situations outside of the kind of more anthropological contexts that it's typically been employed. So there's huge value in structural anthropology, but I think that we can take a step back and think more about where family ties might fit in. So I always like this kind of framework, which I initially stole from Jim, and I put on a lot of comp questions, thinking about how networks operate or how you want to ask questions about networks. One side of it is you might be asking about the architecture of the ties, like what ties exist, things like that. Another one is like what might flow through the ties, how, say, sexually transmitted infections flow through the network or something like that. And then you can sort of have this sort of structural perspective where you're asking about things that we ask about with sociocentric data, like what are the communities in a network, for instance, would be an example. And then you might ask more relational questions like how do people get along, how strongly do they feel about the relationship, how often do they interact, and that sort of thing. And I think in that kind of four-pole space, you can kind of put different questions about family networks. I think a lot of the structural anthropology work really fits in this kind of area, thinking about like how do matrimonial circuits tie different clans together in a tribal society. But there's also a lot of questions that we can ask about what kind of kin availability is there at the macro level? Like how common is it for people to have two living parents and two children and be in that sort of under 18, be in that sandwich generation kind of thing. This also then could pose over into this kind of societal caregiving demands. We can ask about how often do people have two parents that are old and two children that are young, and they might be needing to care for them. But we can also then look how often do they care for them. There are also questions about sort of person-level kin availability. How much of a difference does it have on the wealth building of individuals who are caring for older parents for a very long period of time versus those who are caring for them for a shorter period of time. And we can ask about things like bereavement, which is a lot of my recent work has focused on. How does losing relatives affect your mental health, affect your physical health, affect your kind of mortality risks and things like that. So traditional surveys, like the normal, not the kind that we talk about here, I think are well suited to answer some of these questions. For instance, in some recent work looking at COVID-19, I was interested in asking, is it worse to lose a relative to COVID-19 than to lose a relative to another cause? And I think you can answer this question relatively well with survey-based data, which asks people like, do you know someone who died of COVID-19? And you can compare them to someone who lost a comparable relative in a comparable duration of time to another cause. And in some work with postdocs of mine, we were able to kind of make an argument that I think we could treat this as almost a natural experiment because of the way the data were collected. And we found that essentially those who lose loved ones to COVID-19 were faring substantially worse in terms of their health than comparable people who lost loved ones to other diseases right around the same time. And this suggests all sorts of worse ramifications because short-term mental health signals from losing a loved one tend to correlate very strongly with worse physical health outcomes in the long run, both worse kind of development of debilitating conditions as well as increased mortality risks. I think it's also exciting to think about ways we could kind of do interventions with kinship data. Some of my recent work, which I was just working on just before I came here, we tried to do an intervention on kidney transplant candidates to get kidney transplants, get more people to have kidney transplants. Because if you're dying of end-stage renal disease, you have three options. You could die, you could get dialysis until you die, or you could get a kidney transplant, and that tends to be the best modality, extends people's lives by 6 or 7 years. It's a really effective method. But we're unfortunately in a situation where we have far too few deceased donor transplants, and so the only way to make up the kind of, with increasing diabetes, increasing end-stage renal disease, the only way to make up the gap is to increase rates of obtaining living donor kidney transplants. And so we tried to look at this, and we said, once we looked into the data, we found almost all kidney transplants come from relatives. So is there a way we could come up with better ways to incentivize people to talk to the relatives who are most likely to give them kidneys, talk to the relatives who are in the healthiest shape to be able to actually provide those kidneys, and if we could make interventions to do that. And so we have an experiment in the field that just concluded, or will conclude today, and we'll know all the outcomes from this in a couple weeks about whether we were able to kind of shift people's ability to obtain kidney transplants from living donors, and hopefully also reduce race disparities in that. So I've mentioned some kind of reasons you should care about family and kinship networks, and highlighted some traditional approaches. You can develop interventions on your own. You can analyze traditional survey data. But I think that there are a lot of new directions that could be moved in this field by taking some of the newer tools that are available. So one of the tools that I've done a lot of work with, and that I think is particularly exciting, is this demographic microsimulation approach. Demographic microsimulation is, I think there's an agent-based modeling and simulation modeling lecture later in the week, but it's a kind of a variant of that. Instead of just simulating how agents are interacting, you're also simulating the demographics of a whole social system. So agents are born into the system, they move around, they marry each other, they die out of the system. And through kind of modeling those procedures and bringing in a variety of kind of demographic rates at group level, you can look at individuals kind of interacting with each other and see how the resulting family and kinship networks change in that society. And so here's an example of, at one time period, there's just 4 random people, and then some of them get married and some of them die, some of them move out of the community. But through that kind of compounding process, you end up with, and then they give birth, of course, too. And through that compounding process, you end up with relationships like cousins and siblings and things like that, and it's all age graded, so we can answer some questions that have kind of eluded classic kind of survey-based measurements. For instance, one of the things that really frustrated me early on when I started on this is we didn't know, for instance, how many siblings the average 30-year-old had, which seems like a kind of important statistic to know, but it's just an unknown statistic based on how household demography works, that they don't ask questions about your family that are not living in your household. So microsimulation allows us to kind of bridge those gaps and add additional layers to that, like knowing how many 20-year-old siblings the average 30-year-old has, so we can get a lot more information about this sort of thing. And to highlight some of the kind of benefits of doing this, I think we can kind of gain new understandings of kind of societal interrelationships and the kind of family structures that different societies have. One project that I've been working on for a few years is trying to understand Chinese kinship and kind of Chinese demography, and how the one-child policy and other kind of recent challenges that they face is changing the family structure in that society. And I think one thing that was very surprising that we found from this was that the results go completely against the classical kind of understanding of Chinese society. The traditional view of Chinese society, both in China and in the West, is that this is huge extended family kind of network. Here's an example of an old picture of many people in the same family living at the same time. And so what we did was we threw into a demographic microsimulation China's kind of demographic rates. The UN estimates of the historical rates and current rates are in black, and then our simulation results. So the output of the simulation, we recalculated what the simulation birth rates were looking like, and it kind of matches that pretty well. It's a plausible representation of Chinese demography. And what we found is that contra the classic assumptions of like traditional China being dominated by living family members and things like that, the contemporary era is actually the era that is dominated by large numbers of family. This is largely because in this time period, there were lots of people born, but many of them died. And then starting in the 1950s, 1960s, a little bit earlier, the infant and child mortality rates fell dramatically, which greatly increased the number of siblings that cohorts born in the 40s through 60s had. They in turn then go on to have relatively large numbers of children themselves, which increase the numbers of cousins in that generation and so on. And so we're currently, or we were about 15 years ago, in the kind of peak family era in China. And at the same time, the flip side of this is that the future doesn't look good. The Chinese state, starting in the 80s, implemented a series of policies that are called the one-child policy to reduce kind of birth control, reduce fertility, which led to a substantial reduction in the numbers of siblings. It takes a few generations for that to work out, but China is facing a substantial decline in its kind of available family members. And this presages a pretty big kind of crisis for China in a lot of ways, because their pension system is largely inadequate. It is a society heavily based on personal transfers and personal caregiving. They have very few nursing homes, for instance, very few nurses per capita. So almost all elder care is conducted at the family level in China. And what we see is that we're seeing substantial increases in the numbers of people with living parents, substantial decreases in the numbers of people with siblings. So the per capita burden of caring for elderly parents is rising really dramatically there. Just a side note, I feel like one thing that I want to emphasize is not something unique about China. This is actually a weird feature of the demographic transition that's broadly under-recognized. This rapid growth in the kind of connectivity of kinship networks, or the expansiveness of kinship networks in the contemporary era, is something that we've seen in all the societies that I've looked at. Its timing varies based on when the mortality transition began. So in Western Europe, the United States, this was back 100 and something years ago, but as the mortality rates first fall, that creates the equivalent of a baby boom, an equivalent of a sibling boom, which then translates into the equivalent of a nieces and nephews, cousin boom, all these other kind of kinship booms. Other work recently replicated some of our results for both the US and China, and did a great job of moving way beyond what we did. They looked at every country in the world much more ambitiously than we were able to do. And they see very similar things, that the peak era is sort of in the 2000 kind of realm. Their findings differ slightly from ours because they assume constant 1950 rates, which it kind of creates too many family members in that early period because the mortality had already started to fall, but the basic tenor of the results is very similar. I think that this kind of set of tools allows us to make real big advances on some macro sociological questions about what the future holds, how changes are unfolding in society, and things like that. So one of the things that I've been working on lately is trying to understand better how caregiving pressures might change in different societies, as I talked about with China. And in the United States, the most cited, the most often referred to statistic is this caregiver crisis that's talked about. The caregiver crisis, however, is based on what I view as a really inadequate picture of what's going to happen. It's based solely on the ratio of people over 80 years old to the ratio of people ages 45 to, or 30 to 45, I can't remember what 45 to 64. So it's really just based on a population ratio kind of measure. And it suggests that, yes, there's going to be this kind of increase in kind of caregiving pressures. But it's a very naive kind of version of this. I think that kinship models allow us to go a lot farther than that and examine things like how family might be changing within that context, and to understand how health and other things like that are changing. So this is an example of what I call the data fusion approach, which is you take two things and you smush them together. We took from the Health and Retirement Survey age, sex, race, and health graded kind of associations between your family structure and not receiving care you need for help with daily living among older adults. And we took an earlier projection that we had done for the United States in terms of age, sex, race, family structure, kin availability. And what we find is that it's actually, the caregiver crisis might actually be substantially worse than the traditional ratio-based metric was kind of highlighting. And we're finding even larger growth in the kind of caregiving pressures based on the family structures that are growing in size. So the family structures that are growing in size are the ones that tend to provide the least care to older adults and kind of population change. So it's a big set of problems. Another kind of issue that I've been working on in this space, Jim alluded to, and one of my friends calls me Professor Bummer all the time because I talk about this, is this idea about secondarily affected populations. I think there's a lot of great potential to better understand how we're connected to one another and how some disasters in one place might impact a larger group of people than those directly exposed to the disaster themselves. So early in the pandemic, I got really frustrated reading the news because it was all this, kind of memes and things like that, really saying like, oh, like the only people that die from this are old people, and who cares therefore? And as somebody, I study aging, I know some old people myself, and I care about old people. I think a lot of people do, and so I was very curious. How true is it? How true is it that these are people that are just about to die anyway, that maybe don't have very many connections to society? So I was interested in trying to understand how broadly might the death burden from a disease like COVID-19 be felt in the society. So we used demographic microsimulation at the time. There wasn't a lot known about COVID-19, so we simulated COVID-19 epidemics at different scales. And one of the kind of findings that we had is that really no matter the scale of the epidemic, because of the heavy age-graded nature of dying of the disease, we found that for each person that dies, about 9 people would be related to them and alive. And these relationships vary. Some of them are kind of people who are married. Some of them are people who the person who dies is their grandparent. Some of them are people who are married to those who die, et cetera. But there's a substantial kind of burden at different ages felt from each COVID-19 death. And Jim mentioned this had a huge kind of public impact. They did art on this, which was kind of, for me, like, whoa, I can't believe that science kind of inspired somebody to make art and things like that. There was a memorial put up. Our estimates were that over 10 million people, I stopped tracking this last year, but over 10 million people in the US had lost a relative to COVID-19. Surprisingly, I think, in some ways, the biggest burden of this was on grandchildren losing grandparents, which led me to another set of research questions, thinking about how bad is it for kids to lose grandparents. It's a socially normative experience. Like at some point, almost all children experience a grandparent death, but is it actually having an effect on them? And so we had a series of papers that looked at the kind of learning loss that children experience after losing a grandparent, and it is pretty substantial, as well as increases in delinquency for boys. So, to sum up the microsimulation component of this, there are benefits of microsimulation and downsides to it. The benefits are it gives you this really large-scale perspective, and it's really well adapted to building in projection models and things like that to better understand how the future might evolve demographically. It gives you kind of macro scale kind of questions, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. And you can readily merge it with kind of agent-based models or data fusion approaches or things like that to better understand not just the availability of family members, but also maybe how much care people are giving, how much wealth burden it might create to be providing that care, that sort of thing. The downsides to it, it can be very difficult to implement. The data requirements are typically onerous for it. For instance, you get quite different results if you assume that populations started with 1950 rates versus you take their pre-1950 rates, particularly for countries that experienced demographic transition around the 1950s. It also needs a lot of ground truthing and assumption verification to kind of make it credible. at the end of the day, sometimes people are just like, well, it's still made up data, so I don't care. But I think you can do a lot to kind of convince people that it's true. This brings me to another set of techniques, which I view as very complementary, but also powerful in ways that the microsimulation approach isn't powerful. This comes from an older kind of tradition in demography where back in the 70s, Leo Goodman, Nathan Kiefitz, and Thomas Pullum kind of recognized that we could actually, instead of modeling this with computer agents, we could actually write down equations for expected numbers of family members as long as demographic rates aren't changing. And this idea kind of languished for a really long time, like from the 70s to the 2010-ish period. People were not really using these analytic solutions to these problems. Part of the reason that it languished is because through a variety of reasons, it made a basic assumption that the rates don't change, which is an inherently unrealistic kind of assumption. If you're familiar with like life expectancy or fertility rate calculations in demography, though, it's the same assumption that those make. So it's like, how many family members would you be expected to have according to current demographic rates if they don't change, right? So it's kind of a weird question. But you could answer things like, in 1965, using 1965 US rates, how many older sisters would the average person be expected to have? And a female using 1965 rates would be expected to have 0.62 older sisters, for instance. So you could look at some things like that. In some ways, it's a nice summative statistic, but in other ways, it's so divorced from empirical reality that it doesn't help us tremendously. However, starting about 10 to 15 years ago, a variety of new techniques kind of built on these, primarily by Hal Caswell, trying to build in more realistic sets of assumptions. The first one that was sort of tackled was how to build in changing demographic rates, so you can look at more realistic kind of scenarios, like over the last 30 years, how has this changed? A second one was to not just model female family members, but also be able to model male family members. There are another number of other solutions, like group differentials and things like that, that have been built in recent years. The basic idea, though, is all comes back to this kind of demographic projections framework, which is similar to a life expectancy kind of calculation. And you can simulate with knowing probabilities of death, probabilities of birth, not simulate, but you can analytically solve for what the expected numbers of family members people have. In recent work based on this, Hal and I kind of built a model that you can you can answer how many people you're losing to specific causes of death. I think it's not listed here, but I have a series of papers that are looking at this question of how many people we're losing to specific causes of death. And so that led me to a kind of recent debate that I thought would be interesting to highlight here. A lot of contemporary mortality research in the United States, at least, is very focused on this question of deaths of despair. How much are suicides, drug overdoses, alcohol poisonings, how much of our mortality is being, how much mortality increase owes to those three causes of death, which economists Angus Deaton and Ann Case labeled deaths of despair because they reflect potentially worsened kind of mental health and worsened kind of binge drinking and other things like that. And so this kind of debate has been unfolding since 2015, trying to understand how much of the mortality environment and deterioration the United States has faced owes to those causes. But recently people have started thinking like, oh, well, it's not just about the people who die, they're also connected to other people. Maybe we should try and understand that as well. And so I kind of date this to this, there were people thinking about it beforehand, but in 2023, there was a nice New York Times article called, It's Not Just Deaths of Despair, It's Deaths of Children. Really trying to make that point that like people who die of drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol poisoning are related to other people. And in recent weeks, starting in February of this year, an article came out that tried to kind of quantify this. This article surveyed people with the American Life Panel, which is an online theoretically representative panel, and asked them, how many people do you know who have died of a drug overdose, and then subsequently, if they knew people who died, how badly that affected them. And it argued, I have trouble actually calculating the exact same numbers as them, but I think the basic principle is correct, that it argued that about 40% of Americans had their lives relatively severely disrupted by COVID-19. But you'll notice this is a focus on American adults, right? It's a focus on people over the age of 18. They say, I know somebody who died of overdose, and some proportion of them said, this severely disrupted my life. which got me thinking, okay, so it's 40% of adults, let's assume that's right, but what percent of children? How might this overdose crisis be affecting people under 18? And this is not an easy thing to measure. There are not good surveys of children in general, like there are a few, but they're rare. And there are no internet panels that you can just toss some questions onto if you work for RAND or pay the money to do so, right? So there's not a good way to just field that question immediately for kids. So I thought, well, maybe there's something I could do with some of my approaches. And I thought, it's very unlikely that children are friends with people who are dying of overdose. The average age of overdose in the US is 35 plus. And age homophily kind of guarantees that outside of family members, children probably don't know many people that are 35 plus. Maybe coaches, there are cases, but it's not going to be tremendously a large amount. And even if we could do surveys, having a relative die is rare. My suspicion is that for a child, it's particularly rare. So even if there were surveys, it probably wouldn't have enough statistical power to really be able to capture that. And then, of course, if you were to go back to surveys again, how would you even ask kids about this? Would they know that the person died of overdose? How would they understand that? Is it ethical even to ask them? So in recent work, I've been trying to understand a kind of related problem, which is just how many kids are losing parents to any disease, not just COVID-19, but any disease. And I wanted to highlight this because it's another one of those take two things, smush it together approaches, where we use the American Community Survey and vital statistics rates to estimate the potential increase in children losing parents to any cause of death before they turn age 18. And we find both substantial increases as well as massive racial disparities that the COVID pandemic kind of increased. And then this article came out last week, and I realized, somebody had a very similar idea to some of the stuff that we've been working on. And they took data on people who have co-residential children in the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, and then they simulated, based on those people using drugs, their age, their sex, their race, et cetera, the age gradient of mortality from national vital statistics records, and said how many children would this imply are losing parents to drug overdoses. Their estimate is a very substantial number, and I thought I put it here, 321,566 children lost a co-residential parent between 2011 and 2021. This number, I think, is quite low because of that co-residential parent focus, however. And so I said, I think well, I already did this in April, so this was before that article came out. But I still think that article, while an important contribution, doesn't answer the full story. And so in response to that earlier Athey et al. Article about 40% of adults, I really tried to think how many kids might be losing people that are important to them to drug overdoses. So I took we can't model friends very well with these kind of simulation analytic approaches, but we can model family kind of losses pretty well. So I took how many children would be expected to lose parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and cousins to a drug overdose based on the mortality rates of drug overdoses and these these are not, I keep saying it wrong, sorry, these analytical demographic models to estimate bereavement from a specific cause of death. Our estimate is that in 2020, so not over a period, but at that time, 1.2 million children had lost a relative to a drug overdose. This is, by and large, the biggest contributor are losing grandparents, for instance. That might seem surprising, but there's a fair number of drug overdoses in the 50-plus crowd, and you have 4 grandparents, right? So it can kind of add up. You're 2.5 times more likely to lose a male relative than a female relative, and this is higher among the 10 to 17-year-olds than it is among the 0 to 9-year-olds, which makes sense because the people are more likely to be in that range of exposure to death. I think our results, that 1.2 million actually undersells the scale of the problem rather tremendously because it's a period prevalence measure, right? So it's among kids under 18, how many have lost a parent? Not like what's the expected number they would lose given the current rates. So our estimate, this graph here shows from age 0 to 18, well this is 20, but it says 2. From 0 to 18, children born in 2001, 4, 13, 16. So we can trace their kind of trajectory of loss at each age. So the 1.2 million estimate is the sum of the tops of all of these, right? It's the sum of the currently alive people at each age. But what we see is that the cohort level differences of this aging trajectory are growing much, much worse. And so the average, say, child born in 2013 had lost as many relatives by age 3 or 4 as the average child born in 2004 had lost by age 10. So it's a substantial kind of presaging of substantially worsening levels of this. And the other thing that we did was we checked, okay, well, is it just the drugs? And what we found is that almost, if we look at all relative deaths, we see almost all of this is owing to the drugs. It's not to drug losses. It's not other diseases are expanding at the same rate. And we can go further and answer the New York Times kind of question about losing children, for instance. And we see substantial race disparities in the kind of probability of losing a relative, losing a child to suicide, drug overdose, alcohol disease, and things like that. So this is just suicide here, and you can see just tremendous race and ethnic disparities in that. Which brings me to I think some of the really great opportunities. I would encourage you to go look at the RSOCSIM package, which allows you to do demographic microsimulation, and then the DemoKin package in R, which allows you to do some of these kinship mathematical solution models. They're really great ones for moving forward on kind of trying to answer this sort of question. So they have a workbook. I was hoping to have it available, but it's not. And we had a workshop last year on it. It seems to be kind of available. And this one is out as well, but it's not quite ready to share. I haven't figured out how to share it quite well, but you can download it and play with it yourself. I think you can make a lot of progress. So to wrap up, I want to kind of emphasize that the social networks literature has made huge strides in understanding acquaintance, affiliation, friendship, and other networks, and to some extent has neglected a huge portion of our social lives, which is our family networks, and I think we need kind of new tools to help us understand that. Jim mentioned sort of position measurement. I think that there's a lot of potential for kind of position generator kind of techniques to help us understand family networks better. We might think about new ways to collect ego network data that more fully enumerates family networks, because these are ties that can be activated even if you don't respond to a classic name generator question that you could talk to your cousin about accounting or whatever it might be. You could talk to your cousin about accounting. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of better understand these sort of networks. I think one thing to keep in mind, family networks are particularly important at certain developmental stages. And there's clear link to kind of classic theories about networks in thinking about that. And I think that I would just emphasize, I hope that people find these kind of analyses interesting, because there's a lot of ways we could advance social networks and health research by paying greater attention to family networks as sort of opportunities to analyze as well as sites of intervention. For instance, I saw a really great paper about increasing COVID-19 vaccine uptake by getting grandchildren to talk to their grandparents about it. And it had a huge kind of intervention effect in the positive direction. So the last point that I'll make is that we are in a situation where these are actually going to become more important. I think the narrative of the modern world is that family falls away, it's not as important anymore, and friends and acquaintances matter more and more. But thinking about the developmental aspect of these things, we're facing a world with more and more people in these kind of older age ranges, both in the United States and globally. And so we will see greater importance on family networks owing to kind of the average age profile of the population changing. So I think this is something that should be paid attention to in the future. And so I'll wrap up there and say thank you.
I'm wondering about this kind of, for all of these examples you gave, likelihood to lose a child to suicide, growing kinship ties in China. Is it meaningful to compare that to, say, in China, total population growth, total family members as compared to close family member connections, or in the case of the probability of suicide, comparing it to suicide rates for people under 18? As something grows, is it meaningful to compare that to the...
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, how do we think about, this is something I've struggled with a lot myself, but how do we think about these things are all interrelated, right? The rise in overdose deaths is in part behind the rise in losing family members to overdose, right? And how do we disentangle those two things? I've played with different analogies for this. I think that it's a mirror on that world. In some ways, it's like a funhouse mirror, though. You get a very different picture of what the rise in mortality rates might mean when you think about what it looks like for children's experience of losing a parent, for instance, than you do just looking at the rate of increase. So for instance, in this graph, these are the kind of rate increases in suicide rates, age-adjusted suicide rates between 2003 and 2019. Whereas here, actually, no, I took out the rate-adjusted one. Well, it doesn't give you the same numbers, is the point. It gives you a different perspective on it. So the rate of suicide deaths increased by, say, 10%, but the rate of losing a relative to suicide deaths at certain ages might have increased by 20%. And that reflects both the shifting age structure of suicide deaths as well as the kind of overall level of suicide deaths, as well as changes in the family environment in general. So people might be further in age from their family members than they used to be, and that sort of thing.
Well, I love this. Just a quick question. These are estimates that, by and large, that you've done that are nation totals, right, as opposed to sub-region totals. But I would assume that these events are geographically heterogeneous. So what's the story there?
Yes. So I have a proposal that is going in to look to come up with these estimates at a more local level. The challenge is even at the national level, because of data suppression issues, you end up having to impute small amounts because you might not know, like say you wanted to look at drug overdoses. In 2013, there were only 8 people who died of a drug overdose who were Native American between the ages of 16 and 17. And you want to have that in your model, but the CDC doesn't give out data if it's less than 10. And when you start looking across a lot of ages, you end up losing a lot of deaths and a larger number of them for the smaller race and ethnic groups, which could be a source of bias. So, and then to do what you're proposing, which I agree and something that I'm planning to do, you have to cut it another level by geography and that sort of thing. So you end up with tons of data suppression, disproportionately affecting minority race groups. So that imputation process is actually a challenging part of kind of doing it. And so that's the reason I haven't done that yet.
If you were to get into a census data center, you should be able to do that, right?
Yes, exactly. But you can't display the results. There's result display problems if it is disclosing. So that's exactly the thorny issue that I'm having. So we can get access to it. We can't display some of it. So we're trying to come up with an imputation model that works well enough that we don't have to deal with that, which we need the census data for, but then we can actually display the results at the county level and that sort of thing.
To what extent do you think these estimations could perpetuate inequality? So for instance, census data, I think only a month ago, identifies Arab population as white. So I see kind of in terms of certain graphics that you provided as a way of it could potentially perpetuate inequality when you're now not having further details about certain minority groups, as you mentioned again. Like how would we go about ensuring that that doesn't happen, and how like data combining?
So this is a really, really important question, and actually a big limitation that the census changed to include Middle Eastern, North African populations as a separate category is not going to solve. It's actually going to make it worse, because a fundamental demographic problem is that the data on who dies is coded by somebody else, and the data on what race people are in the denominator is coded by them as individuals. And so this leads to a lot of misattribution kind of errors where you end up with, say, coroners more likely to call people who are Native American white in certain counties than they do in other counties, and things like that. So there's lots of potential errors that need to be kind of solved for that. And as far as I know, the standards of kind of the new race groups are only census-based. So they're not in the vital statistics death coding kind of things. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to deal with that problem. And a lot of opportunity to do it.
I just have a question about spatial mismatching. If you're looking at separating out by geography, if you're using ACS data, how do you plan on dealing with like more rural counties, or to like account for wider error estimates?
So the ACS data, we did account for error estimates, and we have some confidence intervals, but I've learned in these like public reports not to show the confidence intervals because like they don't like them. But we do have the confidence intervals in the full kind of paper, and we tried to use 5-year estimates to deal with that. We have a lot of sensitivity tests with decennial census estimates and that sort of thing. We've also done pop-ests from the census where they put out intermediate estimates that we've tried to do as kind of sensitivity checks as well. And we're working with the we're hoping to work with the Social Security Administration to further better understand this problem.
Sort of a developmental question for you. I'm interested in studying children and their parents. So when you're thinking about collecting kinship type data, like what's sort of best practice? Like I have an idea in my head when I think the earliest I can talk to a kid about their own kinship ties is, and I know they can tell us about school and other things. But at what age range can children really be informants in something like understanding their kinship ties?
That's a really great question, and not one that I've thought of because I don't usually collect kid data. I use some kid data and I model kids sometimes, but I don't. But I've never actually surveyed children. I think and it comes to some of these basic social network questions of what ties you think of versus which ones you maybe actually have too, right? So some of these basic questions that are addressed throughout the workshop of like perceptions versus reality and that sort of thing. My guess is teenagers are probably pretty good at enumerating family-based ties, although there's going to be uncertainty, just like with adults, like in terms of cousins. You ask people how many cousins they have, and you get the answers you get from surveys is completely different than is implied by other things like modeling approaches. Because people include second cousins, and they call their parents' best friends' kids their cousins sometimes. Like there's all sorts of cultural things that lead to biases in that. For asking kids, typical practices would be that you also ask caregivers of them about some of these things. So many of those studies of early childhood that are commonly used, like the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing study, formerly called Fragile Families, uses mother reports of a lot of those sorts of things to understand questions like that. So that's what we use to look at grandparent death, for instance, because it's paternal reports of grandparent deaths, which we think are pretty reliable in terms of dates versus if you ask the 7-year-olds, they might not be as reliable. And it's a sensitive question to ask them that too. Well, thank you. Oh, one more. Okay. We can take it off. Yeah, thank you.